The elderly man sat cross-legged under the Montana sun, his frail shoulders wrapped in an old trade-cloth blanket, his knotted fingers gripping a cottonwood cane. It was difficult to reconcile those withered hands with the image of someone once skilled in handling firearms, or to imagine that his faded, bluish eyes had been among the sharpest of the warriors who fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We were camped that August day in 1938 at the Crow Fair. His name was Joseph White Cow Bull, an Oglala Sioux from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. He had traveled to see the battlefield one last time before his life came to an end. His name, which combined the masculine and feminine aspects of cattle, seemed peculiar when translated into English. In Sioux, Tibloka referred to a male of the white man's semi-domesticated longhorn cattle. A misinterpretation by someone unfamiliar with English had apparently led to its current form. I discovered that White Cow Bull had earned the name at age 14 by taking down a stray longhorn bull with a single arrow. After finishing my first sketch of him, I helped the old man into my car, and we drove south from camp along U.S. Highway 87. We bypassed the entrance to Custer Battlefield and National Cemetery so that he could first visit the site of the vast Indian village where he had camped 62 years earlier. Although the land's appearance had likely changed considerably due to time and the cultivation practices of the semi-agricultural Crow, White Cow Bull was soon able to identify where the broad circles of lodges, each roughly half a mile across, had once stretched along the Little Bighorn River. Extending his hands to show a wide circle, he said, "The Shaheela Cheyenne camp was the farthest to the north. Our Oglala group was situated just southeast of them, with the Brule forming a smaller circle nearby. Next came the Sans Arc, followed by the Miniconjou, the Blackfoot Sioux, and finally farthest to the south near the river were the Hunkpapa." I was 28 years old that summer. While living in this village, I spent much of my time with the Shaheela, because I was as familiar with their language and customs as I was with my own. Over the years I had never married, though I had been with many women. One I desired was a beautiful young Shaheela named Monaseta, or Meochi as I called her. She was in her mid-20s but had never taken a husband from her people. Some of my Shaheela friends told me she was from the southern branch of their tribe and was only visiting in the north. They explained that no Shaheela man could marry her because she had a 7-year-old son born out of wedlock, and tribal law forbade such a union. They said the boy's father was a white soldier chief known as Long Hair, George A. Custer, or possibly his younger brother, Capt. Thomas Custer, whom the Sioux mockingly called Little Hair. They recounted that he had killed her father, Chief Black Kettle, in a southern battle, the Washita Massacre, 8 winters ago, and had taken her captive. He had promised to make her his second wife and had taken her as such. However, after some time, his first wife, a white woman, discovered her existence and forced him to let her go. "Was the boy still with her in this place?" I asked him. I often saw him around the Shaheela camp. His name was Yellowbird, sometimes referred to as Yellowbird or Yellowtail, and his hair had light streaks running through it. During the day, he was always with his mother, which meant I had to wait until nightfall to try speaking with her alone. She understood that I wanted to walk with her beneath a cording blanket and make her my wife, but she only spoke to me from behind the teepee cover and never stepped outside. White Cow Bull remained silent for a few moments, seemingly lost in thought, likely reflecting on the past and recalling the Cheyenne girl Long Hair Custer had dishonored in the eyes of her people. Later accounts confirmed the elderly Oglala's recollection that Monasita and Yellowbird were present in the Little Bighorn camp during the battle. Many Cheyenne sources emphasize that their strict moral code, more stringent than that of the Sioux, imposed severe restrictions on relationships with women who had been dishonored. I was already familiar with several accounts of Custer's winter campaign against the Southern Cheyenne in 1868, many of which mentioned Monasita as having served Custer as an interpreter, despite her apparently not speaking English at that time. "Tell me about the battle with Long Hair," I said. That morning, many of the Oglalas were sleeping late. The night before, we had held a scalp dance to celebrate the victory over Gray Fox, General Crook, at the Rosebud a week earlier. I woke up feeling hungry and went to a nearby teepee to ask an elderly woman for food. As I ate, she said, "Today attackers will come." "How do you know, grandmother?" I asked, but she offered no further explanation. After finishing my meal, I caught my best pony, an iron-gray gelding, and rode over to the Cheyenne camp circle. I searched for Mayatsi and eventually spotted her carrying firewood up from the river. The boy was with her, so I simply smiled and said nothing. I rode on to visit my Shahiela friend, Rowan Bear. He was a fox warrior, part of one of the tribe's soldier societies, and was on guard duty that morning. His post was near the Shahiela medicine teepee, where the sacred buffalo head was kept. We sat together, recounting tales of our past bravery. The morning passed quickly, as an elk warrior named Bobtail Horse joined us to share stories about his chief Dull Knife, who was not present that day. The first indication of any attack came after midday, when we noticed dust rising and heard gunfire far to the south near the Hunkpapa camp circle. At that moment, an Oglala man galloped into the circle, shouting, "Soldiers are coming," in Sioux. "Many white men are attacking." I called this out in Shahiela words so they would understand. I saw Two Moon, the Shahiela chief, running into the camp from the river, leading 3 or 4 horses. He hurried toward his teepee, yelling, "Natskavaho, white soldiers are coming. Everyone, get your horses."
"Hey! Hey!"
The Shahiela warriors cried out their war chant, gathering in a large group as they prepared for Two Moon to lead them into the fight. "Warriors, do not retreat if the soldiers charge you," he urged them. "Stand your ground and fight. Watch me. Even if I know I will die, I will not fall back." It was a speech meant to embolden them for the battle ahead. Two Moon led his warriors out at a gallop. Once Two Moon's group had gone to confront Major Reno, a new threat emerged. Custer's detachment was advancing down Medicine Tail Coulee toward the river and the Cheyenne camp. "They're heading this way," Bobtail Horse shouted. "Crossing the ford. We have to stop them." We saw the soldiers in the coulee drawing closer to the ford, so we moved forward to meet them. An older Shahiela named Mad Wolf, riding a thin, worn-out horse, tried to hold us back, saying, "My sons, do not charge the soldiers. There are too many of them. Wait until our brothers return to help." He rode alongside us for a short distance, warning that such a small group would stand no chance against a whole army. Finally, Bobtail Horse replied, "Uncle, only earth and sky endure forever. If we 4 can keep the soldiers from overtaking our camp, our lives will be well given." The Sans Arc and Miniconju camp circles were set back from the ford. We found a low ridge in the area, dismounted, and took whatever cover we could. For the first time, I noticed 5 Sioux warriors racing down the coulee ahead of the soldiers, dodging the bullets being fired at them. Then Bobtail Horse pointed to a bluff near the ford. At its summit were 3 individuals who, by their hairstyles and clothing, looked like crows. Bobtail Horse remarked, "They are our enemies, leading the soldiers here." He discharged his muzzleloader at them, then crouched behind the ridge to reload. I fired at them as well, seeing that they were targeting the 5 Sioux warriors, who were now dashing across the ford at full speed. My weapon was a repeating rifle, so I continued firing at the crows until the Sioux had safely reached our side of the river. They carried no firearms, only lances, bows, and arrows. Once they reached us, they dismounted and joined us behind the ridge. At that moment, I noticed a Shahiela named White Shield approaching on horseback, armed with a bow and arrows. He was alone, but we welcomed another fighter to our group. That brought our number to 10 to hold the ford. Looking across the ford, I saw that the soldiers had paused at the riverbank. Having never encountered white soldiers before, I distinctly remember how pink and hairy they appeared to me. One soldier, who had a mustache and wore a wide-brimmed hat along with a buckskin jacket, was riding an impressive sorrel horse with a white blaze and 4 white stockings. Beside him was another soldier holding a flag and mounted on a gray horse, while on the other side rode a smaller man on a dark horse. The smaller man didn't appear quite like the others, so I focused my attention on the man in the buckskin jacket. He was staring directly at us across the river. Bobtail Horse urged us to remain concealed so the leader wouldn't realize how few we truly were. The man in the buckskin jacket seemed to command the soldiers as he yelled something, and they all charged toward us across the ford. Bobtail Horse was the first to fire, and I saw a soldier on a gray horse, not the flag bearer, tumble from his saddle into the water. The other soldiers began shooting at us. The man who appeared to be their leader was rapidly firing his heavy rifle. I aimed my repeater at him and pulled the trigger. I watched as he fell from his saddle and into the river. Shooting that man halted the soldiers' advance. They pulled up their horses and gathered around the spot where he had fallen. I fired again, this time targeting the soldier carrying the flag. I saw him go down, and another soldier quickly took the flag from his grasp. By now, the air was thick with gunpowder smoke, making it difficult to see clearly what was happening. The soldiers kept firing repeatedly, and we were constantly dodging bullets that stirred up dust all around us. When the smoke cleared a little, I noticed something unusual. Some soldiers dismounted in the ford and seemed to be pulling something from the water, while others remained on horseback, continuing to fire at us. Suddenly we heard war cries behind us. Turning to look, I saw hundreds of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors charging toward us. It appeared they had driven away the soldiers who had earlier attacked the Hunkpapa camp circle and were now rushing to help us repel this group of attackers. The soldiers must have seen them as well, for they retreated to the far side of the river. Those still on horseback dismounted to fight on foot. As more warriors arrived to join us on the ridge, a loud cry rose up. "Hoka-hey!" the Lakotas shouted. "They are retreating." I saw it was true. The soldiers were fleeing back up the coulee, scattering across the higher ground to the north. Bobtail Horse ran to his pony, shouting to us as we grabbed our mounts. "Come on, they're retreating! Hurry!" He and I led the warriors across the ford, for they knew we had stood courageously to defend the village and eagerly followed us. Another warrior, known as Yellow Nose, a Sapawachasa, who had been taken captive as a child by the Shahiela and raised among them, displayed remarkable bravery that day. After we forced the soldiers to retreat from the ford, he rode ahead of us, approaching dangerously close to them, before swiftly retreating to safety. I stayed with the Shahielas, still hoping that some of them might later speak to Meotzi about my bravery. We gathered for another charge, this time led by the Shahiela chief, Comes in Sight, along with a warrior called Contrary Big Belly. The soldiers' horses, spooked by all the commotion, began bolting in every direction. The soldiers paused their fire as they scrambled to regain control of their mounts. At that moment, Yellow Nose rushed forward again, snatching a small flag guidon planted in the ground by the soldiers. He rode off with it and struck a soldier with its sharp end, counting coup, delivering a blow rather than taking the soldier's life, an act that demonstrated his courage even more. I then noticed the soldiers dividing into two groups, most of them dismounted and retreating while firing as they moved toward higher ground. With this, we stopped making mounted charges. Taking cover, I started shooting at the soldiers. Being an accurate shot and one of the few warriors carrying a repeating rifle, I knew it was up to me to make the most of it. Alternating my fire between the two groups of soldiers, I kept shooting. Despite the smoke and dust obscuring my view, I saw 5 soldiers fall under my fire. Every now and then, a warrior would prove his bravery by charging on his own. I saw one Shahiela, wearing a spotted war bonnet and a robe made of mountain lion skins, ride out alone. "He's charging!" someone called out. He rushed to the ridge where one group of soldiers was making a stand, holding their horses and maintaining steady fire. This Shahiela rode in, nearly close enough to touch some of the soldiers, circling in front of them as bullets kicked up dust around him. He galloped back to us, and we all cheered for him. "Ah!" he exclaimed, which meant yes in Shahiela. Then he unfastened his belt, opened his robe, and shook several spent bullets onto the ground. The old man smiled as he remembered that act of courage. It was a day of bravery, even for our soldier enemies. They fought valiantly and died with honor, except for one soldier on a sorrel horse. This soldier broke away from the others and began riding down the ridge. 2 Shahielas and a Lakota chased him, firing as they pursued, but his horse was swift, and they couldn't catch him. I watched him draw his revolver, thinking he might fire back at his pursuers. Instead, he pressed the gun to his own head, pulled the trigger, and fell lifeless. This might have been Second Lieutenant Henry M. Harrington of Company C, whose body was never identified. Before long, all my bullets were spent, but by then the soldiers had fallen silent. We had killed them all, and the battle was over. Victory cries erupted, and when the women and children heard us, they came to the ridge to strip the bodies and gather some of the large horses the soldiers had ridden. Some women, mourning husbands, brothers, or sons lost in the fight, mutilated the soldiers' bodies as an expression of their grief and anger. I began searching through the piles of the dead for bullets and weapons. Near the top of the ridge, I noticed a naked body and rolled it over. The face had fine hairs and resembled the white man who had worn a buckskin jacket and shot at me from across the ford, the same man I had knocked off his horse. Remembering how close his shots had come to hitting me, I decided to take the medicine of his trigger finger to improve my own aim. Pulling out my knife, I began cutting off the finger. At that moment, I heard a woman's voice from behind me. Turning around, I saw Mayatsi, Yellow Bird, and an older Shahiela woman standing there. The older woman gestured toward the white man's body and said, "He is our relative." Then she motioned for me to leave. I looked at Mayatsi and smiled, but she didn't return the smile. It made me wonder if she disapproved of a warrior cutting on an enemy's body. I figured she wouldn't think as highly of me if I removed the white man's finger, so I stepped away. Pretending to search for bullets, I glanced back. Mayatsi was looking down at the body while the older woman used her sewing awl to pierce deeply into both of the white man's ears. I heard her say, "So long hair will hear better in the spirit land." That was the moment I realized that Long Hair was the soldier leader we had been fighting, the same white man I had shot at the ford. After their victory at Little Bighorn, the tribe scattered. White Cow Bull never saw Mayatsi again after that summer. Perhaps because of her, he never married. Following that day in Montana, I encountered the old man several times at Charlie Thunderbull's cabin near Oglala, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, creating 3 portraits of him before he passed away in 1942.